Hello everyone, welcome to Middle Fantasy. I am your host Zach, and once again I'm in an inner sanctum during a solar eclipse. Well, today I actually have a very interesting topic. Today we're going to be talking about the difference between dark fantasy and grimdark fantasy, because for me, I use those terms very interchangeably and to the point of where people comment about it, so I wanted to get an expert to help me understand this, because when I was looking it up, there are so many different interpretations of it. Today I'm actually joined by an expert. Why don't you introduce yourself, my friend?
I'm Alessandro Martinez. I don't know if I'm an expert, but thank you for having me.
I mean, you got all these horror books and you've written a bunch of spooky, dark stuff.
It's true.
That counts. I mean, I haven't had anything published, so you're an expert in my eyes, and I'm sure to everyone here, and you're an expert. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a horror and fantasy writer. I've written several short stories, horror and fantasy, and I have a novel coming out soon.
Yes.
Or if this is the future, it's come out.
Right. Well, regardless, there's gonna be a link down below. So, Alessandro, in your eyes, what is the difference between grimdark fantasy and dark fantasy? Because for me, I've always found those terms very interchangeably. Like grimdark, from my understanding, is just miserable and depressing, and you're pretty much like, I just hate my life. Whereas dark fantasy is like, wow, everything, this exposure is so dark and can barely see everything, and vampires and goths are so cool. In your eyes, what is the difference between dark fantasy and grimdark?
Are we goths not cool?
No, goths are cool. What are you talking about?
So, like you said earlier, there's tons of different interpretations. So if you ask someone and then ask another writer, they're probably going to give you two different answers. In my opinion, dark fantasy is fantasy with horror elements. So, fantasy setting, and you're fighting against some sort of vampire or monster or Cthulhu. So yeah, the main antagonistic force is something you would find in a horror novel. And then I think of grimdark as, like what you said, it's all sad and it's gritty, and
yeah,
the characters usually they don't have to be like likable people. They're probably killers or assassins
or a-holes.
Right. That's often the case. Yes.
I think people will probably hang me if I don't say, from my very, very basic research before we did this, is I think the grimdark actually was coined from Warhammer 40k, something that I know very little about. I just know that everyone's super buff and all the Marines are super dude bro-y. I'm sure I'm getting that wrong. And also, I just know there's a chainsaw staff because there's a whole video game that I saw someone play once. That's about it. But for me, like when I always think about dark fantasy, I always think of just Jim Henson with the Dark Crystal and Labyrinth.
So, lots of horror elements in dark fantasy. In my description of dark fantasy.
Now, for you, what is the quintessential dark fantasy story for you?
Coraline's a good example.
Ooh, yeah.
I would say, of dark fantasy. Little kids reading that, and they see the other mother. That's pretty horrifying.
I mean, to some people, and then there's other people, it's like, wait a second, I think that's just my mom.
Right, your mom trying to sew buttons on your eyes.
I mean, that won't be the worst thing my mom has ever done to me. I love you, Mom. Don't put buttons in my eyes.
But you would not call that grimdark, right?
No, because in that story, well, I mean, it could potentially be grimdark, but it's a dark fantasy.
Right. She's not like some gritty assassin who doesn't care about the world and...
Yeah, no. Wears capes, wears pants, and just likes playing with knives all day.
Like, when I think of grimdark, one of the first books that pops into my head is The Black Company.
Oh, yeah, by Glen Cook? I want to say something like that. I've read that's a really good story where everyone in that is horrible,
right.
And they're all a bunch of a-holes, and that's what you like about them a little bit.
And there's some like monsters and stuff and supernatural things in that book, but it's not mainly about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, most definitely, especially if you haven't had a chance. I think you can buy it all in an omnibus now, so check that out.
Like, the focus is on how tough and gritty these guys are, and how they're all shades of gray, and amoral.
Yeah, some could say 50 Shades of Grey, but I think that's a whole different book series.
Let's not say
that. Yeah. I mean, a good example of this I would probably give for like Grimdark is probably like, it's not really I guess, yeah, like the Dark Tower series is very sad and very grimdark in many ways. And that would be one that I'd think about. I always think about, because I just finished reading The Prince of Thorns. That one's very, everyone that's horrible and awful,
right.
And that's why you like them.
Right. That's definitely one of the books that pops up when people talk about grimdark.
Yeah.
But dark fantasy and grimdark are not mutually exclusive. You can blend them. People blend them all the time.
Oh yeah.
And the best example that pops right into my head when I think of that is Berserk.
Oh, the anime?
The anime or the manga. It's full of horror monsters and terrible stuff, but then of course all the characters are perfectly at home in a grimdark setting, and they're all tough badasses, and
yeah,
lots of bad stuff happens. Lots of bad grimdarky stuff happens.
For me, the one that I think of if we're going into anime is I love the show Claymore, which is pretty much it's not like Berserk, but it's still grimdark, but has very small hints of optimism.
Right. Claymore is also very awesome.
Oh yeah, it's great.
But yeah, I call it that grimdark. Yeah.
I mean, I think the good example of this as well, I think that people started to point fingers at, was A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin, which I don't consider it to be grimdark fantasy as much. If you actually read it, and people are like, what the hell are you talking about? If you read it, it's not all depressing and nihilistic. There's a lot of horrible things that happen, but you have to place yourself in the 1990s when you see a cover with like a dragon or a guy on a horse, and then you're reading like, what the F did I just read? This is depressing. But if you read it now, it's very tame in comparison to what people think, because characters die quite a bit. That's George R. R. Martin just being like, oh no, that's just what was realistic, because I'm making it more like historical fiction in many ways.
Right. Probably not fully grimdark. Definitely has elements.
Yeah. It bubbles to the surface, but I'd still consider just like an epic fantasy to a degree. Other ones that I think about, for me, I think this is probably going to be a very controversial one, but at times, like the Kingkiller Chronicles can be grimdark, where the character is is kind of an a-hole. He's not likable in many ways, but because he's the main character, you have to like him. But then a lot of horror elements pop up throughout the story quite a bit. That's one that I think about might, again, blur in those lines a little bit if we're going to use those terms.
Right. A good example of is it one or the other would be Dark Souls.
I want to say that's just dark fantasy. Actually, no. Well, it depends. Okay, I think it probably depends on how you play. The worse you do, the more grimdark it gets. But the better you do, the more dark fantasy it becomes.
I would lean more towards dark fantasy, but it definitely has the elements of grimdark as well.
Now, what about Bloodborne?
Bloodborne, one of my favorite games.
That's why I brought it up, because I know how much you love Bloodborne.
I would lean more toward dark fantasy as well. It's definitely a fantasy setting, a Victorian fantasy setting, but it's full of Lovecraftian monsters, which leans more toward horror, which is more dark fantasy, and not just focusing on, your character's this badass, because you can't play them as a badass, but you're gonna die a lot. So how badass are they?
Yeah, and those are kind of the fun things and the fun elements about it, is you have, when it comes to, at least with Grimdark, is it's almost exploring the people that you absolutely like. Oh man, I like, from the villain's perspective, this is great. But then when he burns down the orphanage, you're like, okay, we're supposed to like him, right? Author's like, oh yeah, you're supposed to like him. He's the nice guy in this. Okay. And I mean, like, that's a good example of that too, is kind of Bloodborne. Another one I probably would do is, actually, here's a good question. I guess it's more cosmic horror, but like, have you read like Lovecraft Country by chance?
I have, yes.
Now, would you consider that more Lovecraftian, or would you consider that like a dark fantasy story or a grimdark? Because I find that to be a really interesting nihilistic story.
Yeah, I'd definitely say that was more dark fantasy. It obviously has horror stuff in it, but it's not a straight up horror book.
Yeah, and that's why it's hard to say like it's Lovecraftian, but it isn't the main focus. It just takes the title of it and goes from there. Now, my main question would be then, in the end, if you could turn any property in the whole world into grimdark or dark fantasy, what would you want? Either or, and how would you do it?
Any property.
I was gonna do Star Wars, and because you could turn that into a grisly, horrifying. I mean,
there are the zombie.
Oh yeah,
Star
the Death
Wars
Trooper
books.
ones.
Yeah, Death Troopers and Red Harvest.
Yeah, there's Red Harvest. I was actually reading the first draft of Empire Strikes Back, and the opening of that is a straight up horror movie because it's Wampa's coming in the base, and there's like parts where people like accidentally shoot pipes and they get like flash frozen and stuff, and people getting their arms chopped off, and I'm like, why can't I see that version? I really want like a horror movie where it's like the rebel people that survived the attack on Hoth, but now they have no power in the base and it's getting really cold. Now Wampas are coming out. Would be awesome. I know that there's been a joke about that before, but something like that was like a straight up just people like having to hack off their limbs for because of hypothermia and stuff would be great.
The X-Files, but in a dark fantasy setting.
Oh my god!
Like a high fantasy, Mulder and Scully.
Oh.
They're like, I don't know, inquisitors.
I mean, hey, I'm actually, you know what? That's a good idea for a story. It's almost like the X-Files with this. We're gonna find the mummy. I believe in it. There's aliens, or no, there's eldritch gods out there. You gotta believe.
Instead of the poster, he has like a.
No, it's a tapestry.
A tapestry.
It's the exact same thing. It's just in like a script. There you go. Oh man, kind of want that now. So they do like Bardcore, so you could do. Oh, wait, is there like a Bardcore for like the X-Files theme? I kind of want that now.
Bardcore?
Yeah. Do you not know what Bardcore is?
I do not know. Tell me.
So Bardcore is like taking like popular songs. Like the one that I love the most is Pumped Up Kicks. But they make it into like a medieval theme where they actually change it into yield English.
Yeah, I've heard some of that. I've heard like the Mortal Kombat theme, but medieval.
Yeah, that's called Bardcore, because that's where we live now, in a world where if you're a big nerd, I'm going to make it this version of it. We're synth-wavy. Well, thank you so much for stopping by and talking about Grimdark. I really appreciate it. Where can they find you on social media?
You can find me at my website, salessandromartinez.com, and it has all my social media links on there to my Facebook and Twitter. And feel free to message me or chat wherever you can find me.
And where can they find your book? Because that book's coming out very soon. Or if this is the future, it's already out.
So my book, Helminth, will release January 16th. And you can find it on Amazon and on my publisher's website, Omnium Gatherum.
Well, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, when it comes to everyone here, what is your definition for dark fantasy and grimdark? What are your favorites? What are some you'd recommend? Well, thank you all so much for watching this amazing video. I had a lot of fun hanging out with you. Well, everyone, like always, may your food and drink ever be tasteful, and may your books be filled with fantasy and adventure. Bye, everyone. See ya.